Die Gedanken sind frei.
My thoughts freely flower.
Die Gedanken sind frei.
The purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.
Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? William Blake. Welcome to Freethought Forum. My name is Hugh Henry. Our subject is perception. How the tiger was seen, or not, remembered, or not, and how the tiger got his stripes. This is a true story about something that happened to me some years ago at a Renaissance Fest in Maryland. Some people had brought a young but full-grown tiger there on a very tight chain for people to pet, which was fine by this tiger. He was soaking it up like a sponge. This was one happy tiger. Well, it was getting to be the end of the day in the afternoon, and they were going to go home, and they needed to take him out to take a dump. So they took him out about 50 feet in front of me, side on. Now this is under small open trees with grass about knee high and sunlight coming in, late afternoon sunlight. So to do what he needed to do, he froze. And right in plain sight, he disappeared. I was looking right at him. And I'm telling my mind, there's a tiger there. Oh, there's no tiger there. There's just grass and trees and sunlight. No, you idiot, there's a tiger there, a full-grown tiger. No, there's not. Oh, that tiger, he moved. That was frightening. I have doubted my perceptions ever since. So, how did I get to see the tiger, and how did the tiger disappear on me? Well, let's take an evolutionary look at this. Let's start out with a small multi-celled organism that needs to know whether it's day or night. Well, it doesn't need to know, but part of its cell system becomes sensitive to light, and that turns out to be useful, so it gets a better break on the population. And then there's a mutation, and suddenly there's a bunch of cells like that. It's kind of redundant, but it works out to be rather handy because you can get an idea that there's something larger over there, which might eat you, or something smaller that you might be able to eat. Then there's another mutation, and you get the advantage of being able to detect motion. Now, all of this is sort of good enough. In the case of the tiger, random mutation produced various colorations until it produced a pattern that seemed to work against the tiger's prey. The multi-cell organism had good enough vision to do what it needed to do. And as we evolved, we developed good enough vision. We have good enough vision to swing through the trees and find fruit, and then later to be hunter-gatherers on the ground. And the tiger has good enough camouflage, just good enough, to work against his prey. Doesn't work when he's moving. Well, where's this stuff come from? Well, we're beginning to see the genetic code. And we have discovered when we look at genetic code, it is spaghetti code. Now, if you're a computer programmer, this will cause an instant shudder. If you're not a computer programmer, we're going to have to explain what we're talking about. When an amateur programmer wants to write a program, doesn't know anything about this stuff, they take a list of things they want to do. They lay them out, they take the first thing on the list, and they start writing. Just write. And they get partway down in and they find, oh, they've got to do something back up here at the beginning, and there's a place they want to go somewhere else to do something else, so they put a test and something that says go to, and it goes over here somewhere. And then they pick up the next thing and they find, oh, they should have set some things to 0 at the beginning. So pretty soon you get these things saying go to here, go to there, And if you laid out like 5 pages, the routing would go all over it. And sometimes they find some of the code they've used they could use somewhere else. So they branch back, pick up this section here, and go branch back to where they want to go. Which means that the original purpose of this stuff, if you need to fix that, you're also going to change this over here. Dreadful stuff. Then you decide that you want to change this to something else you want to do, but you don't want to throw out the code. You just want to keep it there in case this doesn't work out and you want to go back to what you did before. So you fix it so that part never gets done. If you're looking at this as someone else, you can't figure out what parts of this are going to work and what parts of this never get, the go-tos never go to. Let me explain how this works inside real animals, real critters. The Russians raise silver fox out in Siberia. And silver fox has nerves that are like overstressed piano wire. They're miserable things to raise. They're vicious. They try to attack the keepers. They try to attack each other. And sometimes they just expire from nerves. So the Russians decided to try breeding for a better disposition. They were very successful. They got a happy little laid-back puppy that you could make into a house pet. Lovely little thing. The only problem was that it had the same coloration as your average collie. White, gray, black, tan. Well, that's not silver fox, and people aren't going to wear that. So now they gave up and live with the rotten silver foxes. Oh, by the way, along the way I described how the tiger got its stripes. Let's move on to perception. So light comes into your eye through the lens to red, green, blue sensitive cells and only black and white sensitive cells, yada, 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 image. But what happens after that? From flat images, how do we get 3 dimensions? How do we see edges? How do we track moving objects? How do we recognize an object to begin with? From this we see that it's the brain that sees, not the eye. And fully 1/4 of the brain is used just for visual processing. All right, so you see the lens, the light, the senses, and getting past there is hard. The initial processing, inputs are grouped into very small areas. If it hits light and dark in the same area, this small area, then it sends a large signal back. If it hits light over the same area, it's a low signal. This gets contrasty areas, and you start to get edges. This gets us to the occipital lobe, back here, and the primary visual cortex. It's 2 millimeters thick. There are cells here that prefer stimuli in the shape of bars and edges. This is what the tiger was taking advantage of. Further studies showed that different cells preferred edges at particular angles, edges that moved, or edges that moved in a particular direction. From here, understanding gets really rough. Imagine sitting in a chair under a pergola porch. That's one where the roof just consists of big heavy beams, air in between, no roof on top. In afternoon light, there are wooden beams with light falling between and perhaps blocked by vines in some places. You see a person or a pet walking across the porch. The light on them is constantly changing. How do you continue to identify the object moving through that light? We don't know. And yet even more complicated tests follow. We are at this point trying to follow the object, seeing what a fish or even a worm can do. Let's take reading. Right now I'm looking at black marks on a page, but I can't see them as black marks on a page. I can only see them as words and phrases. I can't make them go back to black marks. Now if I take off my glasses, no, that's still not, can't get it to a blur. If I turn them upside down, I can still see them. But of course at one point when I was young I couldn't. Now, I've been taught the Russian language, and when you see Russian Cyrillic text, you can see black marks and symbols on a page. I can't. I can only see words and sounds. My perception has changed, and I can't move it back. When I was in elementary school and high school, I played instruments and I sang in the choir. But when I got to college, I stopped that, and I haven't done anything for 30 years. Now when I pick up a sheet of music, I can figure out how much time is supposed to be allotted to each note, but where the tones are, I haven't a clue. That part of my world would have to be rebuilt. My perception has changed. But I'm still looking at the same world. A lot of work has been done with animals. And it's not good enough just to see, whether the animal can see color. They talk about what they call Welt. And since I've been taught version, I read Welt as world. This is what the animal sees back up in here in the brain where it processes. There's a lot of work that's been done with pigeons. They taught pigeons to not read, but to recognize individual letters. And they found that pigeons have the same problems that we do. For example, the capital letters O, Q, and D are mistaken for each other. They also taught them tasks that they'd have to decide something where what they were looking at, we could use the optical illusion stuff that we know about for us, trying to see if the pigeons would see the same optical illusions that we do. And it turns out that they do. So here's an animal that's separated from our genetic line a long time ago, and this is processing that's well up into this advanced processing stuff, and it's the same stuff as near as we can tell. One way to figure out what happens next is to see what happens when things go wrong, when brains are damaged. And that gets us to Oliver Sacks. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, one of his very best books. Sacks is a neurologist and a very good writer who writes about what he sees in his profession. And in particular, the title story here I want to go into. Sacks had a hard time figuring out, just being introduced to this person, what was wrong with him. But he noticed that when he talked to the man's eyes didn't seem to stay on his face. They seemed to, move around a bit. One of the things he found out is when he handed this guy a glove and asked him what it was. And he said, he says, it's a piece of leather that's been sewn back together to form a sack, and then there have been tubes of leather that have been attached to it, but I have no idea what it is. Sacks never, in his article in here, doesn't quite deal with this. He calls it a lack of judgment. The name for this problem this guy has because of brain damage is agnosia, a general term for a loss of ability to recognize objects, peoples, sounds, shapes, or smells. That is, the inability to attach appropriate meaning to objective sense data. It is usually used when the primary sense organ involved is not impaired. This guy could see perfectly well. But he couldn't do anything with the information. Now they've looked at this, looking at various process chains, and what they've determined, and this is still going to leave a big hole, is you get that initial processing that I talked about, getting lines and edges, and objects are picked out. I don't know how that's done. And then objects are compared with an internal library of objects that you know or are taught. Then the next stage is to attach semantic meaning. What's the purpose of this thing? And finally to name it. They have people with brain damage at various levels. The man who mistook his wife for a hat didn't have access to his object library in present time, but if you asked him to copy a picture of an owl, for example, he could copy the picture, but he wouldn't know if it was an owl. If you asked him to draw a picture of an owl, he could do that, If you asked him what a glove was and how to describe it, he could do that. But from what was coming in, he couldn't make the comparison. Oh, when he got up to leave, he tried to pick up the head of his wife who was sitting next to him and put it on his head as a hat, which of course didn't work. This is Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum talking about perception. Let's talk about something else that can go wrong. On public radio about a year and a half ago, they had a program that was seriously frightening, at least to me. There are people who hear voices, but not the voice you hear in your head when you think. No. What they're hearing is a person talking right here into their ear, as if there was a person standing right here when there isn't. And if they turn their head, it moves with them. And these people are sane. They know there's something wrong here. They know they have to ignore it, and it's very difficult. A group of these people made a tape that they played on the air of what these voices sound like, and it was awful. They're extremely negative. Things like, "You're dirty, you're dirty, you're dirty, dirty, dirty. We know you. We know all about you." Stuff like that, and it just goes on. How they manage to stay sane must take a terrible effort. Some people don't. Some people decide that they're hearing God, or demons, or angels. And that reality isn't our reality, the reality of the people that hear these voices and learn to ignore them. I'm very thankful for that. There are other realities out there. Schizophrenia, autism, people who have taken psychedelics and taken a look around there, or simply blind people. These are all different worldviews, different Urvelts, different things going on up here representing the world out there. How do we know which one is right? Well, we could go with a consensus reality, but a consensus reality depends on who you're with. For example, if you're with a group of people who are with the Reverend Moonies, you have a very different reality from most of the people in this country. We know about that as atheists. Does that mean we're nuts because we can't see God? No, consensus reality won't work, so what's real? Then there's the problem of dreams. I'm not sure about that visual cortex processing with the edges, but when we REM sleep, when we dream, every other part of the brain that does processing, and we can at least identify those areas, is operating. When we do PET scans, etc., for brain activity, all sections of the brain we have identified with that later visual processing are operating the same way that they do when we're awake. Now, there's a story of the Chinese philosopher who dreamt he was a butterfly, and when he woke, he wasn't really sure whether he was a philosopher who dreamt he was a butterfly or a butterfly who dreamt he was a philosopher. But based on just that visual center activity, we can't tell either. Now, we can tell looking at other areas of the brain, whether you're asleep or not, whether you're dreaming or not, but all that critical visual processing stuff, we can't tell. Imagine you're sitting in front of your TV set at home, plugged into cable, and some klutz walks behind the TV set, trips over the cable, yanks it out, and nothing changes. There's still program there. How do you know you ever got cable? How do you know you were ever connected? How do you know, reality? If dreaming can produce reality, how do you know you're ever getting the right picture? Well, you could ask about, all right, what do blind people dream? I'm not sure, but I think it depends on when they went blind. If they were blind all the way from birth, I don't think they have the same visual processing, but if they weren't, yeah. They use visual processing centers to process their information. What we do know is no matter what happens, when they read Braille, the same parts of the brain are used as we use in reading. we're in a position of the famous blind men and the elephant. They turned them loose on an elephant. One walked straight into it and said, "Oh, it's a big warm wall." Another one walked into the ear and felt it and said, "Oh, it's a big warm leaf." Another one ran into the trunk and said, "No, it's a snake." And another guy ran into the tail and said, "No, it's a rope." One of them tripped and grabbed and wound up with a leg and said, "It's a tree trunk." Well, they took them away and they all argued and argued. We're in somewhat the same position looking at the world around us. Now, there are other versions of this story beyond 5 men looking at other parts of the elephant, but those are X-rated and we're not going to cover them on this show. So each has his own firm picture of the reality of the universe. Native Americans have a way of dealing with this. They say that we all sit around the same council fire, but we all see it differently. It's because we're seeing it at a different angle. What they mean is that each viewpoint at the council fire is valid. Okay, so we've managed to perceive whatever we've managed to perceive. Now we got to remember it. Of course, there are the prodigious memory feats of the concert pianist, but of course I'm interested in showing where it fails. Beginning with eyewitness testimony. There's been a lot of work done on that. For one thing, they asked people about the weather 7 days ago, and they found that their recollections to tell you the weather 7 days ago were about as good as their ability to predict the weather 7 days from now. There's also a problem of misleading information or misleading questions. That if somebody asks you, did you see the broken headlight? Then you're going to remember you saw the broken headlight. One of the researchers decided that maybe you were trying to please the questioner. So he put reward in there. Some people he didn't pay anything. Some he paid $1, some $5, some $25 to see whether they would go with the misleading information from their questioner to please the questioner. Turned out it didn't make any difference at all. It wasn't trying to please the questioner. Then there's false memory. A lot of work has been done by the University of Washington in Seattle. What they did is they took student volunteers and paired them with close relatives, older relatives. And they asked the relatives for incidents in the student's childhood and wrote a short paragraph. And they tossed in a paragraph about something that never happened. That the student had gotten lost in the mall at 5 years old. Of course, they first checked to see that none of their subjects had ever been that way. And they told the students they were checking to see how well they could remember childhood incidents. That's what they said their research was. And they gave them the first interview and asked them, and of course nobody remembered the lost in the mall. And then they set up a second. They said, try and remember more about this stuff. And they set up a second interview some weeks later, and now a third of them could remember being lost in the mall and gave them details. They asked them to rate the confidence of their memories from 1 to 10, how good they thought those details were. And the real memories went from 1 to 10. The false memory hovered around 8. Then they told them that the false memory was planted. And they asked them, which one do you think is planted? And many of them couldn't believe that lost in the mall was planted. They could actually remember something that never happened. This is before we get to regression hypnosis, past lives, and alien abductions. I've got another problem. I remember my mother's been dead for quite a few years. I have an image of her in my mind. I remember her. I don't know how much of it is her. I had an image in my mind when I was with her. I don't know how much is her. She had a mental construct of me. Of course, we all make very sure that they know as little as possible about that. You have a mental construct of me. How accurate is that? I have one of myself. And Friends could tell me a lot more about me that I don't know. So what have we accomplished here? The world, even the everyday world, is plagued with misunderstanding. We have a system that's patched and good enough for a hunter-gatherer or a monkey. At this point, I'm afraid we descend to the level of poetry and metaphor, which is where I'm going to go. I'll start with Lewis Carroll, a mathematician, a relentless logician, who always questioned reality. The Mad Gardener's Song. He thought he saw an elephant that practiced on a fife. He looked again and found it was a letter from his wife. At length I realized, he said, the bitterness of life. He thought he saw a buffalo upon the chimney-piece. He looked again and found it was his sister's husband's niece. Unless you leave this house, he said, I'll send for the police. He thought he saw a rattlesnake that questioned him in Greek. He looked again and found it was the middle of next week. The one thing I regret, he says, is that it cannot speak. He thought he saw a banker's clerk descending from the bus. He looked again and found it was a hippopotamus. If this should stay to dine, he said, there won't be much for us. He thought he saw a kangaroo that worked a coffee mill. He looked again and found it was a vegetable pill. Were I to swallow this, he said, I should be very ill. He thought he saw a coach and four that stood beside his bed. He looked again and found it was a bear without its head. Poor thing, poor silly thing, it's waiting to be fed. He thought he saw an albatross that fluttered round the lamp. He looked again and found it was a penny postage stamp. You'd best be getting home, he said, the nights are getting damp. He thought he saw a garden door that opened with a key. He looked again and found it was a double rule of 3. And all its mystery, he said, is clear as day to me. He thought he saw an argument that proved he was the Pope. He looked again and found it was a mottled bar of soap. A fact so dread, he faintly said, extinguishes all hope. The second one is from Paul Simon, called Flowers Never Bend in the Rainfall. Through the corridors of sleep, past shadows dark and deep, my mind dances and leaps in confusion. I don't know what is real, I can't touch what I feel, and I hide behind the shield of my illusion. The mirror on my wall casts an image dark and small, and I'm not sure at all it's my reflection. I'm blinded by the light of God and truth and right, and I wander in the night without direction. No matter if you're born to play the king or pawn, for the line is thinly drawn twixt joy and sorrow. So my fantasy becomes reality, and I must be what I must be and face tomorrow. So I'll continue to pretend my life will never end, and flowers never bend in the rainfall. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? Not immortal, we create the symmetry in our minds. Reframe or fail to frame the tiger. The forests of the night exist in our minds and are remembered there, or not. We live in an uncertain world. This is Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum, about perception and tigers and of the night.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no